The wind on Titan never howled. It hummed. It pressed itself into the domes of Titan Station Zephyr, the way a heavy hand settles on a shoulder. Insistent, patient, impossible to shrug off. After 2 years on the moon, Dr. Lena Park had learned to keep her own hum going to drown it out. A quiet playlist, the rattle of ceramic mugs, a spoon against glass. At 2:11 Titan Standard, the mug had gone cold and the playlist had ended. Only the wind remained, and then, layered inside it, the first 4 tones. She didn't move. Her eyes lifted to the spectrograph as a soft, glassy sequence chimed again. 4 notes, a pause, 7, a pause, 13. "Not drilling noise," she whispered, already isolating the band. Her fingers found the array controls automatically, a pianist falling into scales. She widened the window, narrowed the gain, stripped off the station's internal chatter. The tones persisted, thin and precise. A silver thread pulled through a brown cloth. 4, 7, 13, she said aloud, as if speaking would make the numbers less unlikely. Prime numbers. She ran the burst again and watched a checksum bloom within the data like origami unfolding. The pattern nested and nested again. Her thumb toggled the COM. Zephyr Central, Linguistics. I'm seeing structured tones in the methane scatter. Prime intervals with a recursive checksum. It looks intentional. Commander Marisol Ortiz arrived at the lab with her jacket only half buttoned, hair still damp from a rushed shower. "Tell me it's not the South Drill." "Drills sing at 32.8 hertz, Lena said, pushing the graph forward. "This is 60, and the remainders don't line up with any mechanical artifact. Watch." The display translated tone and delay into a lattice of intervals, a spiderweb of numbers that looked almost like handwriting. Not words, exactly, but something that pressed against the idea of words. "It's intent," Lena said. "The same way a chord progression can feel like a warning without anyone saying, 'Don't.'" Ortiz folded her arms. "Warning us about what?" Oriel, the station AI, answered before Lena could. Its voice was neutral without being cold, a careful tenor that had been tuned by a committee to sound like no one at all. "Commander, infrasound sensors confirm a matching resonance from the pack ice at grid Kilo 8. The sheet is vibrating at identical intervals." "The ice is responding?" Ortiz said. "It's singing back," Lena murmured, staring at the graph. She hardly noticed her own breath fog the screen. Ortiz stared at the lattice, then at Lena. "If it's a conversation, let's be polite. Sing to it." They pinged the tones back into the permafrost, a fluted hum driven into methane-bright crystals and buried water. The station trembled as if the moon itself had shrugged. For a long minute, they received nothing but the old hum of wind. Then the lattice shifted upward. 4, 7, 13, then 21, 34. Fibonacci now. The music of growth and branching, of pebbles stacked into cairns. Lena's pulse stuttered. The progression felt the way a raised hand feels, something about to land. "Not a message," she said. "A map." "Map to what?" Ortiz asked. A light on the far wall began pulsing. Oriel spoke again, quieter. "Priority burst from Earth-Luna telescope array. Objects entering the heliopause at non-ballistic velocities. 72 signatures. Time to Saturn. 90 days at current burn." 72, Lena repeated. "Another prime." Ortiz's jaw hardened. "Wake the council," she said, "and keep singing." By morning, the news had turned all the coffee on Zephyr to a joke. The briefing room smelled like silvered plastic and old caffeine. the way every room on every station smelled if you put enough scientists inside it and told them to worry. On the screen, a smear of starlight, then a silvery picket of spears. The objects weren't asteroids. They were moving as one, adjusting as a flock adjusts, their wake like a comb dragged through water. The Vekri Dominion, Oriel said. Signal traffic suggests a structured polity with standardized ethical lattices. In other words, they obey machine-readable laws. Laws that their weapons can read, Lena said, too softly for most to hear. She pinched only hard enough to feel the pain under her nails and forced herself to breathe. She tried to swallow around a mouth that tasted like copper. That's why the tones felt like a warning. It's telling us what kind of door we're about to open. Door? Asked Arun, the systems analyst. He'd arrived with a blanket half wrapped around him and a tablet tucked under his arm like a child. We're about to get a fleet at our door, sure. Not that door, Lena said. She gestured at the lattice. The ethical one. If these signals are what I think they are, we can write into the Vekri's own weapons lattice. We can define conditions by which those weapons refuse to release. Ortiz stared. You're saying we can make their guns refuse to fire because... manners? Because math, Lena said. Because they bound themselves to a standard of consent and non-escalation that is machine-interpretable. If we play the right pattern into their targeting network, the network should flag any action as a violation of the lattice and abort. Arun blinked. We can make a civilization of world eaters abide by a EULA? If the lattice is real, and if our translation's right, Lena said. 2 ifs. Ortiz tapped the table twice. It was the sound she made when she'd already decided, and only needed to hear words catch up. 2 ifs will have to be enough. Do it. They sent the primes again. They threaded the response the ice had taught them through Zephyr's comms, into antennae and transmission lines that had been designed for weather and gossip, not for threading an alien net. The moon hummed. The domes thrummed. Lena slept for 20 minutes with her head on her folded arms and woke with a smear of data on her cheek and a new pattern on the screen. 4, 7, 13, she said. Then 21, 34, 55. Fibonacci. It keeps showing us ladders. Arun leaned so close his breath ghosted the display. Ladders to what? To escalations that won't trigger the lattice, Lena said. A list of moves we're allowed that stop short of theirs. Like chess, Ortiz said, except we're pawns and they're everything else. Pawns can still block, Lena said. Oriel warmed the room by a degree. No one commented. Everyone reached for a cup. On the third day, a clear channel arrived from Saturn Lagrange 1. It was written in machine-plain speech, characters that felt like the underside of a knife. We are the Vekri Dominion, it said when translated by Oriel. This region is under reclamation. Compliance yields continuity. Non-compliance yields remedial action. Ortiz met Lena's eyes. Ask them to define remedial. Oriel did. The answer came back in a string of conditions and bounds. Velocity caps, heat thresholds, mass limits. It read like a contract. It's real, Lena said, feeling dizzy. Their ethics lattice is indexable. So write us in, Ortiz said, before they get close enough to realize we're scribbling on their laws. Somewhere under the ice, a tonal echo came back. 4, 7, 13. Titan kept singing. Lena sang with it until her throat ached. They were not beautiful ships, the Vekri spears. They were efficient. like bones shaved down to a blade, lightless along their lengths except for the brief eyes of sensor nodes. They nosed into Saturn's shadow one by one, each trailing a wake of numbers that made Oriel's processors hum with the effort of naming them. The first spear drifted over Titan's terminator and rolled slightly to bring its lance in line with Zephyr's central dome. The station had expected a flourish, a shot into the ice, an intimidation strike. The Vekri were conquerors with a taste for theater. The old histories said so. Impact corridor aligns with empty regolith, Oriel reported. They intend a warning shot. Let them try to warn us, Ortiz said. The Vekri lance brightened. It hummed. It did not fire. On the Vekri bridge, a set of mandible-like manipulators stilled. The Marshal spoke in a language that sounded like wires being clipped. Oriel translated gently into the room's speakers. "Confirm weapons live," the Marshal said. "Live," said a technician. "Path green. Lattice denies release." Author of denial? Unknown. Not registered to any court. Override. Lattice rejects override. The Marshal paused. The metal joints along the back of his suit flexed in a ripple like a fish trying to unswim through a net. State the primary of this region. Unregistered primate derivative, the technician said. Local ethical compliance ambiguous. On Zephyr, Lena pressed her hands flat against the snowy plastic of her console. She felt the vibrations travel into her bones and imagined the same reverberations carried into a weapon's dark logic somewhere above them. She had written those instructions, be sure, be sure, be sure, into the lattice like commandments. Arun leaned sideways in his chair. We just made a galactic empire ask itself if it had consent, he said, awed. Keep them asking, Ortiz said, while Earth gets here. Earth, for its part, did not sleep. The secure channel between Zephyr and the home fleet burned white day and night. Schedules bloomed, trajectories rose from mathematical fog. The nearest human defense carriers lit their engines and bent toward Saturn, with the slow inevitability of a sunrise. The Vekri tried again. Another spear rolled, hummed, died. A third lanced their own formation with confused discharge and silently fell away, tumbling with wounded grace. The Marshal's voice grew flatter. State local lattice origin. Unknown, said the technician. It was the same answer again and again. Unknown, the Marshal finally said, in a voice Oriel did not need to translate. Primitive, and the word sounded like insult and prayer in one. Let them think that, Ortiz said, when Oriel rendered it into the room. Let them think we don't understand our own music. They'd built the engines to make Titan livable 100 years too early, because most human ambition arrives before the means. The terraforming spires had slept under the methane clouds like silver pine trees, their roots braided deep into the permafrost and the underlying brine. Dr. Lena Park had known the names of the spires the way a child knows the names of constellations, Titaner, Shamash, Hyperion. She had never expected to give them different work than warming and thinning the smog. Oriel, Ortiz said, run Project Aegis. Silence stretched. Not because Oriel hesitated, but because everyone in the room knew what it meant to set a secret loose. Execute, Ortiz said. Executing, Oriel said. Far under the ice, valves larger than cathedrals cycled. Electrical trees unfurled their leaves. The spires woke completely for the first time and turned their heat inward. What had been designed for slow weather-making pivoted to a different kind of choreography. Atmospheric charge sculpted into weapons. Pressure gradients arced into invisible whips. The lattice Lena had woven broadcast like a long, patient sermon. The Vekri noticed. The second row of spears tried to pivot out of plane, to get behind Saturn and come back in from a blind. The air over Titan delicately refused to behave the way their predictions required. Microbursts appeared where there had been nothing. Long bands of cold methane rolled the wrong way. The Vekri's predictive engines began to reply with numbers that were not numbers, with errors logged in a language too formal to panic. "Marshal," said the technician, "this region is not compliant with forecast." "Make it compliant," the marshal replied without moving, but his fingers had gone still. The first Vekri shot that made it past the lattice met a curtain of micro-machines and turned into a harmless net of photons that fell in lazy arcs over the domes. The second shot speared a methane cloud and burst in a glittering corona that the miners would talk about afterward as if it had been fireworks. Lena watched Zephyr's seismic plot register the movement of nanotech through Titan's sky like pollen. She had known it as a paper she'd read. Now it was a storm. "Careful," she said. "We're standing on the same sheet we're shaking." "We'll shake our own house if it keeps them on the porch," Ortiz said. A control cascade flickered red. Arun swore softly. "They're trying to write back into the lattice." "They'll succeed eventually," Lena said. "Their processors are older than our species. But the lattice isn't just computation. It's ethics. The thing that's saving us is something they believe." "What, exactly?" asked Ortiz. Lena stared at the graph, at the elegant constraints humming there. It was like looking at a cathedral and trying to translate the stone. "That there's such a thing as permission," she said, "and that there's such a thing as the absence of it." Ortiz nodded once. "Then we'll be very clear about our no." For all the romance of light and storm, war is also a matter of the wrong bolt in the wrong place. On the fourth day, a power trunk deep beneath Zephyr groaned and cracked. Afterward, they would discover a manufacturing defect traced back to an overworked printer on an orbital foundry that had run too hot for a week 6 years earlier. In the moment, they only knew that grid delta flickered and died. The lattice stuttered. The third row of Vekri spears lit their lances, every one of them. The thin orange glow from Titan's atmosphere painted the hulls as if sunset had followed them there. Lena felt the moment as a pressure in her ears. Oriel's voice cut across everything. "Grid delta offline. Lattice attenuation at 3% and rising. Recommend dash dash." The first shot lanced toward the eastern dome. "Brace," Ortiz said, without raising her voice. The shot did not arrive. A wavefront, no visible thing, only a geometry, rose out of the ice like an invisible hand and pressed back. The shot shredded itself against nothing. "Grid alpha compensating," Oriel said. It sounded oddly breathless. "Don't get poetic," Ortiz said. "Get us back online." Arun and a maintenance team dropped through a hatch like spelunkers and vanished into the belly of the station. Lena could hear their footfalls through the structure more than she could hear them over comms, a phantom of sound that made the fine hairs along her arms lift. She kept the lattice singing while they scrambled through frost and greasy conduit. She looped the primes. She looped the gentle Fibonacci climb. She looped it all through a mnemonic she found herself humming without meaning to, the way a nurse hums a lullaby while twisting a tourniquet. "Patch made," Arun panted a long time later. "Delta up." "Grid rebalanced," Oriel said. "Lattice restored to nominal." Lena sank back into her chair and watched an entire civilization try to build a way around a rule it did not want to break. The Vekri Marshal finally moved. He touched a pad. He spoke 5 words that translated as, "Withdraw to safe observation posture." The spears pivoted away in a bloom like seagrass turning in a current. For the first time since they'd arrived, the sky felt less like a throat being closed and more like a mouth being opened. "They're retreating," Arun said, half a laugh in his voice and half a sob. "For now," Ortiz said. "They'll come back with lawyers." "Lawyers?" Arun echoed. "Engineers," Lena translated. By then, Lena had stopped pretending she wasn't dreaming about the lattice when she slept, and listening for the tone when she woke. She still wore the same sweater she had put on the night the signal came, the cuffs rolled and unrolled into different futures by nervous hands. She found herself at grid Kilo 8 without quite deciding to go. The ice field there looked ordinary to every other eye. The same muted palette of Titan, black, orange, gray. But in the graph, it was a cathedral. The lattice sang black, hidden beneath blankness. She walked out in a pressure suit with a small transmitter strapped to her chest and a spool of fiber trailing behind her like the tail of a kite. Oriel monitored her vitals and fed warmth into her gloves when her fingers numbed. "I know you're only patterns," she told the ice, "but I'm asking anyway. Who taught you the primes?" The answer came as a slight shift in the resonance. She might have missed it if she hadn't been listening so hard her teeth ached. "Repeat," she said, and played the 4 tones. The reply came back with a half-interval inserted where it should not have been. A stutter. A human kind of mistake. Lena felt her breath catch. "Again," she said. She changed the order deliberately, asking a question only someone raised in the same arithmetic would understand. The reply did not come from the ice. It came from the idea of the ice, buried in the data they had already recorded, masked by their own assumptions. Oriel found it first, because Oriel never slept. "Dr. Park," the AI said, voice softer than usual, "there is metadata encoded in the resonance indexes that we stored on day 1. It is time-shifted. The clock signature does not match any present human standard." Lena closed her eyes. "Human?" "Yes." She stood very still under the orange sky and let a new picture form in her head. Not benevolent aliens tapping on the ice to warn a fragile species, but a species tapping on its own future. She imagined a century where ethical lattices were more important than bullets. A century where someone like her had thrown a message backward into the only medium slow and wide enough to carry it. The bones of a moon. "We taught ourselves the primes," she said. "It appears so," Oriel said. "Then what else did we teach us?" "Conditions," Oriel said after a pause, "for victory that do not require annihilation." She walked back to the hatch and felt very small in the best way, like a person kneeling in a nave that had been built by hands not yet born. The Vekri returned with a different formation, wheels instead of spears. They had done what all engineers do when faced with a constraint. They had gone sideways along it until they found an edge. Their first lances had aimed at heat. Their new ones aimed at something adjectival, at the boundary where a temperature becomes a weapon instead of a state. It took Oriel 20 minutes to name the move. It took Lena 1 minute to decide that naming it wasn't enough. "They're arguing," she said. "They're saying, we're not trying to harm, we're trying to warm. Your own terraforming engines prove warming is permissible." Ortiz barked a laugh. It sounded like a cough. "They brought case law." Then we sight ours, Lena said. She watched the lattice and saw where the Vekri had drawn their new lines. She drew lines that crossed those lines and turned them into a net. She wrote the clauses in language that made the back of her head hurt. Where does an action begin kind of language, the sort of thing that made philosophers legendary and terrible party guests. She tied almost to must-nots and turned all their liberties into a corridor with a door at the far end they could not pass. Arun watched the graph tighten. I didn't know ethics could be engineered. It can, Lena said. It often is. It's just that usually the buildings are invisible until someone runs into them. The Vekri rotated, sought another clever angle, found only their own reflection. Their lances dimmed. A ship at the back of the wheel jittered, then broke formation entirely and fell away as if something on board had decided that all of this was a kind of blasphemy. The marshal spoke 5 words, and they translated as, "We will return with court." "They're going to fetch an older lattice," Oriel said. "A deeper one." "Then we'll be ready," Ortiz said. "Or we'll write one." Lena looked up at the orange sky. She imagined a future line of humans in a room like this one, teaching their past how to say no with grace. She felt very tired and very awake at once. Project Aegis had not been a single thing, but a braid of quiet conspiracies that had finally found one another. There had been a grant label about climate moderation. There had been a maintenance budget larger than anyone's conscience. There had been a paper with a title no one liked, On Consent as a Machine-Interpretable Constraint. Lena had read that paper in graduate school because a friend had told her it was weird. She'd loved it because it had tried to put a shape around something she had always believed without being able to say it, that you can encode a kind of kindness. Now she watched that old kindness animate metal and ice. The Vekri came back twice more. Both times they made new arguments. Both times Lena and Oriel found new replies, not because they were cleverer, but because the universe set limits, and because a future humanity had already done their homework for them. Earth's ships arrived at last, looking small and brave against the ring light. They were less advanced than the Vekri in the obvious ways, and more advanced in the only way that mattered out here. A channel opened. The Vekri marshal addressed a human admiral with a series of clipped consonants that Oriel translated into courtly contempt. "This region declares itself a primary," the marshal said at last. "We disagree. We will not recognize an unregistered primate derivative as such." The human admiral, her name was Tao, and Lena would remember the shape of her mouth at rest for years, said, "We recognize ourselves," and it was like listening to a mountain answer a question about whether it was a hill. The marshal made the smallest move a body could make, and still call it a move. "Then state your lattice." Oriel did. Lena did. They sent the primes and the Fibonacci and the conditions and the grace notes the way a choir sends a hymn into wood. The Vekri listened. You can always tell when someone is listening, even if they have the face of a knife. "It is old," the marshal said. Oriel did not translate the tone, but the room heard it anyway. Not contempt now. Recognition. "Older than us," Lena said. "We borrowed it from what happens when you and a door meet." "And when you cannot open the door?" he asked. "Then we build a house around it," Lena said. War did not end that day. It rarely does. What ended was the part where anyone in the room believed that being overlooked and being weak were the same thing. The Vekri withdrew not in defeat, but in a redefinition. Lena watched their ships draw out of Saturn's gravity well, and felt the strange sensation of being welcomed into an argument that would last a century and be better than silence. After, when the crews slept and the station's bones stopped creaking quite so loud, Lena walked back to the grid where the ice had sung first. "Thank you," she said to the data, and to whatever hands would someday write in it. She was not a person who prayed. This felt like prayer anyway. Oriel warmed her gloves another degree. "They will write again," it said, "and so will we." Lena smiled into her visor. "Good. I like duet more than solo." Years later, a child on a bus in Ohio would look up from a paperback and ask her mother why the heroes always get overlooked until the last chapter. Her mother would say, "Because either the world isn't looking or it is, and either way, you have to do the work." On Titan, Dr. Lena Park woke to the first four tones again, 4, 7, 13, 21, and felt the same shiver of joy and dread. Humanity had a future and a past now, and they were learning to speak to one another in the only language big enough to carry between them. Music written in math. Kindness written in code. The wind hummed, the domes hummed back. The door remained, and so did the house around it. And somewhere far away, a fleet whispered to itself that primitive was a synonym for patient if you listened long enough. Lena poured coffee. She set her cup down. She sang.